So a little while ago, I wanted to texturize some foam, so I made this. It's just a PVC pipe with a bunch of crap glued to it that I thought might let me just whack some dents into some foam, and it didn't really work. Ever since then, I've been sort of on a mission to try and figure out how to beat up foam permanently, but I never actually did anything until a little while later when I had a table that I needed to destroy. So I decided I wanted to weld together a bunch of little miniature axes. I made my own sharpened implements, and now I will talk a little bit about that process. So I'm a welder. I learned everything I know from my dad. And when we are welding, we sometimes accumulate large quantities of scrap metal. Most of this is when we get pieces, say like, grates, grills, things like that, that have squares etched out of them. Those squares aren't always cut all the way out. So we have to go in with a hammer and just pop, pop, pop.
Away at my heart. He's so sensitive.
We end up with a lot of those little bits, and I wanted to do something with them. It's funny, I didn't actually end up using that many of the bits that I wanted to use, because turns out some of them are kind of useless, which is why we call them scrap metal. But nevertheless, I did manage to make a few axe options. This was the first one I made. For this one, I used mostly stainless. There's these like door hinge brackets that we get that have like a loop cut out of them. And so if we get the scrap metal for that, it's like just this little squared off hook. This was originally a circle. I sandwiched it between two of those hooks and then put a little plate on the back end of those hooks to make a hammer portion. There were three, because then the last one, I put the hook at the bottom so that it would help with the grip. A funny thing happened when I was welding all that together. So I tacked those at the top and the bottom. Tack is when you just zap it for a little bit to leave a little glob of weld on, but you're not actually welding it yet. But I didn't tack it in the middle. So when I was going to weld it downwards, I had it clamped to a table so that I could weld downhill. I was welding one side of it, and when I stopped and took off my welding helmet, I realized that the heat had made all the other two sides bulge outwards. I really should have thought about that in advance, because if we're working on like an official project, like we were very careful about like tacking everything together so that the heat doesn't warp things. Luckily, I was able to catch it before anything was like permanently damaged, because it was glowing red still, so I knew I had time to grab a clamp it back together, then tack it, and then weld the other two sides so that hopefully the heat kind of evened it all out. Also, I had a water bucket nearby. I had that water bucket there for two reasons. One, I'm impatient and wanted things to cool faster. Two, I wanted to feel like a blacksmith. So yeah, routinely I kept dunking things in the water just to cool them off quickly, because that's what you do. And then I could still hammer it out if it wasn't straight enough for my standards. I sharpened the circle, kind of cut it down into a slightly more triangular shape, smoothed the whole thing out as much as I could with a grinder. Well, not as much as I could, but as much as I wanted to at the time. And then I bound up the handle with a lot of tape so that it's comfortable. At one point, I tested it out on a block of wood, and that must have just been a particularly crumbly block of wood, because it split apart immediately. And that's when I realized that I actually made deadly weapons. That's not necessarily saying as much as you might think it is, because really anything can be deadly if you know how to swing it. But still, now I knew what I could do with these things. The problem is, though, they've never worked as good as when I first tested them. And it's not just because they were sharp, because I've sharpened them. So it must have been that block of wood was just ready to split, because every other thing that I've tried to destroy, like that table, for example, it doesn't chop apart as much as I would like it to. I worked on all three of these kind of simultaneously, but next thing I'm going to talk about is the mace. So I actually made use of our newly acquired press. That was fun. I pressed the cylinder into shape, and I had to sand down the handle. I had this wooden handle just lying around. I didn't know what to do with, so I thought, okay, I'll make a wooden handle. That way I can theoretically like warm up the metal if I want to texture foam, because this is the main one that I thought I'd be using on foam. I'm not entirely sure if it works, but we'll get to more tests later on. Attaching it to the wood handle was actually kind of tricky. I pressed it on there and it was very secure, but then when I started welding on the cap, smoke started pouring out of what little crack there was. I realized, like, I don't know why I didn't think about that before. I thought that, oh yeah, like, I'm welding the metal part, I'm not welding the wood part. It won't get hot enough inside there to burn up. No, it did. I just didn't think about it. I didn't put that much thought into it. But it literally caught on fire inside the head there. So I had to beat it off of there and then put the embers out. So I worked on the head separately, putting all these globules on there. And when I was ready to put it back on the handle, that's when I really felt like a blacksmith, because I kind of threw caution to the wind and I was like, well, the only way I'm gonna get it securely on the handle is if I heat it up and expand the metal. So I broke out the torch, got it red hot, and then I threw it on the handle and shoved it in water as fast as possible. And it did smoke a lot, so it probably could have caught the handle on fire. But it didn't, because it was in water for most of the time. But yeah, once it cooled, the metal contracted, and it is now clamped on the wood very tightly. Last but not least, I did this one. This was actually probably the simplest to make. It's just a pipe that I squeezed with the press, and then just welded 2 pieces on for each end of the axe head. But this one, I don't know, something about this one, it just looks right. It looks like something you could actually see in like medieval combat. Just something about the size and proportions and the weight of it. This one's a little heavy, because like most of the weight in this one, most of the weight of this one is kind of in the handle area, because it's a solid metal handle, which for an axe this size, having a little extra weight doesn't hurt, because it'll just help deliver down. But if all the weight is near the hand, then it doesn't smack as much. But I guess it's still functional. This one's very light. Like, this one feels nice when you hold it, and I could get a lot of swings in with this one and not feel tired. And then I also just wrapped the handle in tape. It didn't require as much tape because it was a better handle anyway. The previous video, you would have seen me test out the axes on the actual table that I need to destroy. But now I'll probably just play around with it for the next couple days and see what all I can destroy, what all can it do. I have these axes, I might as well do something with them. And specifically, I'm gonna see what all I can do with this one, because I'm still having trouble, like, actually texturing foam. So I just want to see what it will do. Like, how much abuse can I put a piece of foam through? By the end of this video, I will have an answer. So how did my impressionable implements fare? Well, as I discussed a little bit in the previous video, that table took a bit of a beating. But the main thing I was after was the mallet, because I really wanted that to be able to texturize foam and beat it up and make it look not like a smooth, flat foam surface. I wanted, like, you know, sometimes I want concrete, sometimes I want rock, sometimes I just want damaged metal. At first, I thought it just wasn't gonna do anything, because it seemed like nothing was, it would kind of tear the foam at times, it would kind of beat it up a little bit, but it didn't look like what I wanted. It either wasn't permanent, or it was like too permanent, like it would tear the foam, and that's not usually what I want. Turns out, I think the main problem is just heating it up enough, the foam that is. At one point I thought that I could heat the metal of the mallet, or the, what am I saying? Mace. I thought I could heat up the metal of the mace and like press that into foam, and I probably still could, but I'd have to heat it up a lot, and then I'd have this hot mace lying around. So I may not want to do that. But there was a time when I really kept the heat gun on the foam, and I was able to get a pretty good pattern down. It looks like moon rock. It really looks like the surface of the moon. So I'm not sure like how often I'd use that texture, but I can probably play around with the timing and the pressure a little bit to see how and when I get this moon rock look. Because here on the end, it's a much subtler impression. So that looks like kind of what I want with the stone or concrete feeling. I think it'll work, it just needs a little more tinkering. A little more finesse.
Check out the finesse.
I don't know if finesse is the word to use when I'm talking about a mace used to beat the crap out of foam, but it's the word I'm going to use.
Please turn it off. I will give you this $1 I found in your pocket.
Oh, you can keep that.